At 3:47 p.m., on a warm spring Thursday in Elkwood, Oregon, a little girl vanished. No screams, no crash, just silence. 1 second she was in her backyard coloring chalk hearts on the patio. The next, her crayons were scattered and she was gone. By 4:03 her mother had called 911. By 4:22 a German shepherd named Rex was sniffing the wind. And by 5:09 that dog would do something no human could. The street was like any other in small-town America, lined with tulip trees, American flags fluttering above porches, and kids riding scooters up and down the sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad ever really happened, where dads grilled on Tuesdays just because, where people still left their doors unlocked, which made it all the more horrifying when Sophie Green, 6 years old, disappeared without a sound. Her mother, Melissa, had been inside folding laundry. She had the baby monitor on, though Sophie was almost too old for it. It was more for peace of mind than anything. One ear on the monitor, one eye on the folded socks. She remembered humming along to a commercial on TV, something cheerful, and then realizing the house had gotten too quiet. Melissa stepped outside. Sophie wasn't on the patio anymore. Not by the tree. Not near the swing set. Not anywhere. "Sophie!" she called. Nothing. Her voice got sharper. "Sophie!" Still nothing. By the time she reached the fence line, Melissa's heart was already in her throat. She ran to the neighbors, banging on doors, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. A few kids had waved earlier, said Sophie had smiled and showed them her drawing. That was maybe 15 minutes ago. That's when Melissa called the police. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hit the numbers. Officer Mark Ellis was the first to arrive. He'd grown up in this town. Elkwood wasn't the kind of place where you expected kidnappings, or missing persons cases, or, well, anything worse than a shoplifter at the Rite Aid. But when dispatch mentioned a 6-year-old possibly missing with no witnesses and no sound, something in Mark's gut tightened. He brought Rex. Rex wasn't just any dog. He'd been trained to track fugitives, detect narcotics, and locate survivors in building collapses. But most of all, Rex had an instinct, one that Mark had learned not to question. Melissa met them on the porch, tears streaking her face. "She was just here," she kept saying. "I swear I was only inside for a second. She was drawing chalk hearts. Look, her crayons are still there." They were, lying scattered beside a rainbow-colored heart with a half-finished "I love Mom" scribbled beside it. Rex sniffed the air, tail stiff, ears forward. Mark crouched beside Melissa. "We're going to find her," he said gently. "I need something of hers. A sock, shirt, anything she's worn today." Melissa rushed inside and came back with a little yellow t-shirt that had unicorn glitter peeling off the front. Rex sniffed it once, then twice, then huffed, and then he took off. They followed him through the backyard, past the fence, but instead of heading toward the road, Rex did something strange. He stopped, turned back, and began circling the garage. Mark frowned. "What's he doing?" Melissa blinked. "There's nothing back there, just the storage unit. It's locked." But Rex didn't care. He paced, whined, scratched once at the garage door, then darted to the side yard where a narrow walkway led to a rusted tool shed Melissa hadn't used in years. "Is this part of your property?" Mark asked. "Technically, yes, but that thing's falling apart. I haven't been in there since last winter." Rex barked once, then again, louder. His nose was pressed against the frame. Mark walked forward, trying the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Is it locked?" Melissa nodded slowly. "Always." Still, Mark drew his flashlight and peered through a grime-covered window. Dust? Boxes, old paint cans. Nothing moved. Then Rex growled. It wasn't the usual bark for attention sound. It was low, primal, focused. "Get bolt cutters," Mark radioed. The shed was unlocked 3 minutes later. It was empty. At least it looked that way. Rex stepped in and immediately began sniffing along the far wall. where a stack of moving boxes had fallen sideways. "Stay back," Mark told Melissa. "Let him work." The German shepherd moved slowly, his ears twitching. Then something changed. Rex froze, pressed his nose to the floorboards near the back left corner. Then he lay down, nose still to the ground, whining. That was his sign. She was here. Mid-story call to action, natural and soft. If you believe dogs like Rex are more than heroes, they're lifesavers, please consider subscribing to Heroes for Animals. Stories like this deserve to be shared. Mark knelt down beside his partner. There was no trap door, no visible basement, no signs of forced entry. But Rex wouldn't move. He scratched once at the floor, then looked up at Mark. "Are there any crawl spaces, drains, access points under this thing?" Mark asked. Melissa's face was pale. I think there's a vent around the back, but it's too small for a person." "Not for a dog." Mark led Rex around the shed and found it, a narrow air vent covered by rusted mesh. He pulled it loose, barely fitting the dog through. "Go," he whispered, and Rex went. For nearly 4 minutes there was silence. Then a bark. 2. Then silence again. Mark crouched, trying to follow the sound. He pressed his ear to the side of the shed. Nothing. Then, thump! A muffled sound like movement. A faint scratch. Then something softer than a whisper. A sob. "Oh my God!" Melissa gasped. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, already shouting into his radio. "We've got signs of life. Repeat! Signs of life. Bring thermal imaging and medical." He didn't wait. With Melissa's permission, he and 2 more officers began ripping up floorboards from the corner. The light was weak, but what they saw made everyone freeze. There she was, Sophie, curled up beside a heater vent, arms around her stuffed giraffe, eyes red from crying, lips dry and chapped. She looked up, slowly. The first thing she said was barely audible. "Doggy?" And then she fainted. They carried Sophie out in silence. Officer Mark cradled her like she was made of glass. She didn't make a sound. Her breathing was shallow. Her tiny fingers curled loosely around her giraffe plush. Behind them, Rex stayed close, never more than a few steps away. His ears were still perked, his muscles tense. It wasn't over, not yet. The medics arrived moments later, their lights flashing blue and red against the trees lining the quiet neighborhood. They rushed her into the ambulance. Melissa tried to climb in too, but her knees buckled halfway up the step. A medic caught her. "She's stable," he said quickly, "but severely dehydrated. No sign of external trauma. We'll run tests." Melissa nodded, but her face was frozen. Not in fear, not anymore. In disbelief. As the ambulance doors closed and sped off, she turned to Mark. "She was in the floor," she whispered. "I don't even know what that space is. I've lived here for 7 years and I didn't know—" "You're not the only one," Mark said gently. "There was no blueprint of a sub-basement. Nothing on your title report." They both turned toward the shed. Officers were already stringing yellow tape around it. A team was inside, mapping every inch. But even now, no one could explain how Sophie had ended up beneath the floor, sealed in a forgotten utility crawl space that wasn't supposed to exist. And how Rex, only Rex, had found her. They brought Rex water first, then a piece of beef jerky, which he ignored. He paced the driveway restlessly, circling back toward the shed every few minutes. He barked once at the back corner, then whined and looked at Mark. Mark crouched beside him. "You're not convinced, are you?" The dog's eyes were alert, focused, unsettled, and Mark knew that look. Rex wasn't just proud of a job well done. He was trying to say, "We missed something." At the hospital, Sophie regained consciousness an hour after arriving. A pediatric nurse found Melissa in the waiting area, sitting beside a vending machine with her hands folded like she was in church. "She's asking for you," the nurse said. Melissa nearly tripped rushing down the hallway. The room was quiet. The IV line clicked every few seconds. Sophie's eyes fluttered open when her mom appeared, and her mouth pulled into the faintest smile. "You came," she whispered. Melissa pressed her forehead to Sophie's and let out a sob she'd been holding since the second she realized her daughter was missing. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie blinked slowly. "Where's the doggy?" Melissa laughed through her tears. "He's okay. He found you, baby. Everyone's calling him a hero." Sophie didn't smile. Instead, her eyes went wide, like she remembered something. "No," she said quietly. "I heard him." Melissa sat up. "You heard him?" Sophie nodded. "Before he barked. I was crying into the wall, and then I stopped. And I just started whispering." "What did you whisper?" "I said, 'Please, someone hear me.' And then the doggy scratched the floor." Melissa stared at her daughter. She remembered Officer Mark saying Rex had started growling before the bark, that he'd frozen, listened, and now this child, barely 6 years old, was saying that before he ever barked, the dog had heard her whisper through a layer of wood and insulation. Meanwhile, back at the Green residence, Mark stood by the shed as the forensic team returned with scans. "No footprints inside the crawl space," one tech said, shaking his head. "And no handprints either, just the kids." "Any fingerprints on the outside lock?" Mark asked. "Only the mom's. She said she locked it a week ago after grabbing Christmas bins. That checks out. No signs it was forced open." "But how did Sophie get in there?" Mark pressed. The tech shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine. And that wasn't good enough." Mark walked the perimeter with Rex again. This time, he paid attention not to the obvious, doors, fences, windows, but to the air. It was cooler now. The sun was dipping behind the trees. The breeze picked up just enough to carry the scent of motor oil and pine. Rex paused suddenly near a side gate, sniffed, then growled. Mark looked closer. There was a patch of disturbed mulch, subtle but present. Something had been dragged here. A footprint. Then another. Not Sophie's. Adult-sized, boot treads, and heading away from the shed. That night, Mark reviewed the house's security footage. It was mostly pointed at the front yard and driveway. A Ring camera on the doorbell. A backyard cam that stopped recording last week when the batteries died. But something else caught his attention. A neighbor across the street had a dash cam. Mark visited the house at 9:30 p.m., apologizing for the hour. The man was friendly. Retired firefighter. Said he didn't know Sophie had gone missing until he saw the ambulances. He gladly handed over the dash cam card. At 3:32 p.m. that day, the footage showed a white work van parked briefly on the street. No logos. Just plain white, dented bumper and tinted windows. The van idled for 2 minutes, then pulled into the Green's driveway and vanished out of the frame. It didn't come back into view again. There was no footage of anyone leaving. The following morning, Rex sat at Mark's feet while he reviewed the findings with his team at the precinct. They had no evidence of abduction, no signs of forced entry, no noise, no witness. And still, Mark circled one word in his notebook: intent. Whoever moved Sophie didn't panic. They didn't break things. They locked her in a hidden space and left. Why? Was it a mistake? A prank? Or something worse? He looked at Rex. "You saved her," he whispered. The dog tilted his head. "You heard her." By noon, the story had already hit local news. Canine rescues child trapped beneath storage shed. But the headlines didn't capture what really mattered. Rex didn't find her by smell alone. He listened. In a world full of noise, sirens, walkie-talkies, barking dogs, panicked voices, he'd stopped and heard the softest sound in the world. The voice of a scared little girl whispering into the dark. And that changed everything. At home, Sophie didn't want to sleep in her bed that night. Melissa sat beside her, brushing her hair slowly, softly. "I can't go under again," Sophie said. "You won't, sweetie? You're safe now. Can the doggy come visit?" Melissa smiled. Maybe. We'll ask." But before the girl closed her eyes, she whispered something else that Melissa wouldn't mention until much later. She said, "There was someone else. I think I saw boots." The thing about small towns is, people talk. By Friday morning, the story had already made its rounds across Elkwood. The green girl had been found alive. A police dog saved her. There was no break-in, no ransom demand, just mystery and whispers. Mark Ellis, however, wasn't interested in rumors. He was sitting at his desk with a half-empty coffee mug and a copy of the neighbor's dash cam footage paused on frame number 403. The white van, parked, engine idling. He leaned in. The timestamp read 3:32:18 p.m. Sophie had disappeared at 3:47. 15 minutes. Just enough time for someone to slip in, lure a child, and hide her somewhere no adult would ever think to check. But it was the tread mark in the mulch that kept him up the night before. Rex hadn't forgotten either. The department had already done a background check on Melissa Green. Clean record. Single mother. Worked remote for an online education platform. No suspicious connections. No disgruntled relatives. No recent disputes. Sophie's father wasn't in the picture. Hadn't been since the pregnancy. The neighbor's footage didn't show anyone getting out of the van. No plates either. The angle missed the rear completely. Mark turned to the lab report just delivered that morning. Mulch sample, partial tread impression, deep set, men's size 11. Brand, possible Red Wing work boot. Not uncommon, but not meaningless either. He took another sip of coffee. Cold. At 9:17 a.m., Melissa called the station. "Hi, sorry, this is Melissa Green. Sophie said something strange this morning." Mark sat up straighter. "Go on." She said the man had a cough. Mark paused. "What man?" She didn't say man exactly. She said, "The person with the boots coughed a lot." He scribbled down the detail. She didn't see his face? She's not sure. She said it was dark, that she was grabbed by the arm and that she thought it was a game at first. And then she was suddenly inside the crawl space. Any mention of being hurt? No, but she said she heard him breathing from the vent while she cried. A chill worked its way down Mark's neck. "Melissa, I'm going to come by. Can you ask her if she remembers any smells or sounds besides coughing?" "Sure, she's coloring right now. I'll be there in 20. The Greens lived in a modest ranch-style home tucked at the edge of a cul-de-sac. Melissa answered the door in a hoodie and jeans, hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, exhaustion all over her face. "She's better today," she said as she led Mark into the living room, eating, talking, but she's different. Sophie sat at the coffee table, coloring in a picture of a dog. Mark recognized it. It looked exactly like Rex. "Sophie," he said gently. She looked up. No fear, just curiosity. "Hi, officer." "Hi, sweetheart. That's a good drawing." "That's Rex," she said proudly. "He heard me." Mark smiled. He sure did. He sat down across from her on the floor, slow and patient. "Your mom told me someone was there when you were hiding." Sophie nodded, carefully coloring Rex's tail. "He had boots." "Did you hear his voice?" "No," she said, "but he coughed a lot." "Like he was sick?" She shrugged. "It sounded like when Grandpa smoked too much. Scratchy." Mark jotted it down. "Did he say anything to you?" She paused. "One thing." Mark waited. He said, "Don't scream." That was enough to turn his stomach. "Did you smell anything?" Sophie wrinkled her nose. "He smelled like gas station soap." Mark blinked. "Like those soap bars in public bathrooms?" She nodded. "The green kind. It's yucky." That afternoon, Mark pulled security footage from every gas station within 5 miles of the Green house. Only one had working cameras covering the restrooms, a Chevron, tucked between the main road and the high school. He got lucky. At 3:26 p.m. on the day of the incident, a white van with a dented bumper pulled into the Chevron lot. No front plate. The driver never went inside for gas. Instead, he parked at the edge of the building, near the restrooms. At 3:28, a tall man in jeans, black hoodie, and work boots exited the men's room. And he coughed. It wasn't loud, but on the sound-enabled camera, it came through. Rough, dry, raspy. Mark paused the footage. Couldn't see the face, hood was up, but the timing matched. Van arrives. Man enters restroom. Reeks of institutional soap. leaves, heads directly toward the greenhouse neighborhood. The video didn't lie. Mark sent the footage to the FBI field office in Portland. The local team would take over from there, but he wasn't stepping away. Not now. Not after Rex had nearly clawed through plywood to find Sophie. Later that evening, Mark walked Rex around the perimeter of the property again. The dog was focused, nose low, scanning. At the shed, he stopped, sniffed the air, growled once, then bolted toward the east fence line, right where the tracks had been the day before. "Rex!" Mark called. But the shepherd leapt up against the fence, pawing at the planks. Mark walked over, and there, tucked behind the bush line, was something new, a crumpled rag. He pulled on gloves and retrieved it. It smelled faintly of soap and sweat. It was likely used to wipe down the van door handle. Sloppy, but valuable. By Monday, the forensic results came back. DNA sample, partial match in CODIS. Parole. Name, Travis Linney. Age, 37. Previous convictions: breaking and entering, petty theft, attempted abduction, dismissed. Last known residence, Vancouver, Washington. Too close for comfort. Mark stared at the photo. Thin, gaunt, greasy brown hair, hollow cheeks. And in every booking photo, Red Wing work boots. The pieces were falling into place. FBI agents picked up Linney that same night outside a motel on the interstate. He was sleeping in the back of the white van, engine cold, rear doors unlocked. No sign of another child, but plenty of evidence. A rope, plastic zip ties, a candy bar wrapper, and a list of addresses. One of them, the Green household. When word reached Melissa, she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, trembling. "He was watching us?" she whispered. Mark nodded. "We believe he'd been scouting the neighborhood for days. But how did he know about the crawl space?" Mark shook his head. "We think he didn't. We think he was just trying to hide her quickly and quietly." She looked up. "If your dog hadn't—" "I know." They sat there in silence for a long time. Rex lay beside the car, ears twitching with every bird call, every passing sound. He was still listening, always listening. That night, Mark drove Rex home and made him a steak. Not kibble, not treats. A full, grilled sirloin. The dog devoured it in minutes, then curled up beside Mark's couch with a deep sigh that sounded like relief. "You did it good," Mark said, running a hand over his partner's head. "You didn't just find her. You heard what no one else could." The trial was months away, but the headlines came fast. Canine dog saves girl from hidden abduction attempt. Parolee arrested in Oregon after German shepherd locates missing child. She whispered through the floor, and a dog heard her. Rex was suddenly everywhere. Local stations, national segments, even a late-night talk show mentioned his name in a monologue. But none of that changed the way he behaved. He still stretched every morning at 5:15 sharp. He still barked at squirrels on the south fence behind the station. And he still sat beside Officer Mark Ellis like the day nothing happened. But Mark knew better. Something had changed, not in Rex, but in himself. The morning after the arrest, Mark stopped by the Green house. Not as an officer, not on a call, just as a man bringing a dog to see a little girl who wanted to thank him. Melissa opened the door with a tired smile and a mug of black coffee in hand. "He's all she talks about," she said, nodding toward the living room. She even renamed her stuffed giraffe. Now it's Rex Jr. Mark laughed softly. "He'll be glad to know he's got a legacy." Inside, Sophie was waiting by the couch, wearing a T-shirt 2 sizes too big with a cartoon German shepherd on it. The moment she saw Rex, her whole face lit up. "Rex!" she cried, running forward with the kind of open-hearted joy only a child who has known true fear can feel. Rex trotted to her, tail wagging, eyes soft. He let her throw her arms around his neck, let her press her cheek to his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, letting her hug him for as long as she needed. Mark swallowed hard. Something about the quiet made it hit him. This wasn't just a rescue, it was healing. They sat outside for a while, Melissa on the porch steps, Mark beside her, Rex resting at their feet, as Sophie played with sidewalk chalk again. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she drew two dogs, one with a badge and one with a pink collar. "I think I want to be a dog doctor," she announced, coloring Rex's tail purple. Melissa smiled. "A vet?" "Yeah, but just for heroes." Back at the precinct, things were less sweet. The FBI had finished cataloging everything they found in Linny's van and motel room. There was a notebook. That's what changed everything, because in that notebook there were 5 names. All children, ages 4 to 9, all girls, all within a 50-mile radius of Elkwood. Sophie was on page 2. Her name, her age, her school, a sketch of her house, an X over the shed. It wasn't random. It was planned, meticulously. Linny was no opportunist. He was a hunter. The other 4 names were blurred out in the press, but internally, the department had already placed those families under temporary watch. Mark stared at the list. Each child had a space for access point and escape route. Sophie's had one extra line. "Too quiet, needs sound." That was the sentence that made his blood run cold. Linny didn't just look for homes with weak locks. He studied silence. He used it until a sound barely more than a breath betrayed him, and Rex had heard it. The next week, Rex received a medal from the mayor of Elkwood in front of the entire community. They held the ceremony in the city park, right beneath the old war memorial near the lake. Kids lined up to pet him. News crews tried to get him to bark into microphones. One lady offered him a peanut butter cake in the shape of a bone. He wasn't interested. He just sat beside Mark, tongue out, head high, like the soldier he was. Mark let the ceremony finish, shook hands, gave the obligatory sound bites. But when it was over, he and Rex took a walk along the tree line. It was quiet. Finally, no cameras, no questions, no eyes. "Do you know what you did?" Mark asked aloud. Rex didn't answer, of course, but he looked up, gave a soft huff, and leaned gently into Mark's leg. And that was enough. That night, back home, Mark opened an envelope he hadn't touched in years. Inside, a photo, a younger version of himself, holding a leash attached to a yellow lab. His first partner. Her name was Casey. She'd passed 3 years ago, died in her sleep, curled up on a blanket beside his bed. He didn't realize he'd started crying until Rex walked over and pressed his nose to the picture. "She was a good one," Mark said quietly. Rex licked the edge of the paper, then curled up beside his boot. 2 days later, Melissa called again. "Mark? Hey, sorry to bother you. Sophie asked if she could send something to Rex." He smiled. "Sure. What is it?" "A letter." She delivered it by hand. Inside the envelope, written in marker on pink construction paper, was a drawing of Rex with angel wings. Above it, in big, uneven handwriting, it said, "You're the only one who heard me." And below it, "Thank you for listening." Mark pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk. Every time he looked at it, he felt something in his chest unclench. But Rex wasn't done, because the story wasn't over. Later that week, Mark received a call from a detective in Vancouver. "We raided a property Linny had visited 3 times this month," the voice said. Mark sat up straighter. "And? There's a cellar." Silence. Same kind of setup. Hidden hatch, soundproof insulation, and a collar chain bolted to the wall. Mark closed his eyes. How many kids? None there? But there were toys, a pink blanket, a bottle of strawberry shampoo. More silence. "Whatever you did, you stopped him from using it." Mark didn't answer. He looked down at Rex, who was lying under the desk with one paw crossed over the other. The dog opened one eye and looked up. Mark reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You heard what the rest of us didn't. And that, more than any weapon, badge, or law, was what saved her." 3 weeks had passed since the day Sophie whispered through the floor, and a dog answered. To the rest of the country, the story was a flash of headlines, a feel-good tale of a heroic canine who defied the odds. But in Elkwood, Oregon, the ripples hadn't stopped. People walked a little closer to their children. Locking doors became second nature. Some installed security cameras they'd never bothered with before. And every time someone saw Officer Mark Ellis and Rex walking through town, they waved. Kids pointed. Parents gave soft nods that meant more than words. But to Sophie Green, it wasn't about the dog that rescued her. It was about the dog who listened. Melissa Green had started taking Sophie to therapy, not because she was broken, but because she had been through something no 6-year-old should. And Melissa was determined not to let her carry it alone. The therapist was kind, soft-spoken, kept toys in her office, let Sophie talk at her own pace. But after 2 sessions, Sophie had only spoken 2 full sentences, both about Rex. He heard me, and his ears were the only ones that knew. Melissa mentioned this to Mark in a call late one afternoon. She didn't mean to cry, but the words caught her unexpectedly. I wish she'd open up to someone, anyone. There was a pause on the other end. Then Mark said, "Let me bring him." It was a sunny Tuesday morning when Rex walked into Dr. Harper's office like he owned the place. Sophie lit up the moment she saw him. She dropped her crayons, ran across the room, and dropped to her knees beside him. Rex nudged her cheek with his nose, then lay down beside her, paws outstretched, eyes steady. Dr. Harper just blinked. "Well," she murmured, "this might be my easiest session yet." Sophie didn't say anything at first. She just stroked Rex's ears gently. Then, like turning on the light, she started talking. Not in a rush, not loud, but sentence by sentence, story by story. She told him about the shadows in the shed, about the voice that told her not to scream, about the long hours spent curled into herself, whispering until her throat was raw, about the moment she heard scratching above her, and about how she knew that the dog on the other side of that floor wasn't just looking for her. He was hearing her. By the time the session was over, Dr. Harper had tears in her eyes. Melissa sat outside the room, hugging herself tightly as Mark came out with Rex. "She talked," he said quietly, "the whole time." Melissa burst into tears. "Thank you." Mark looked down at Rex. "Don't thank me." From that day forward, Rex became a regular at Sophie's sessions. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m. he'd lie on the same rug, his head on his paws, as Sophie drew, talked, asked questions, and slowly unspooled everything tangled inside her. Sometimes she told him about dreams, other times about school, and how the other kids were treating her like a superhero, even when she didn't feel like one. And one day, she whispered something only Rex heard. Dr. Harper didn't ask what it was. She just made a note in her file that Sophie was finding her way back. Meanwhile, Mark was still working closely with the FBI on the Linney case. More evidence had surfaced. Another child, a girl from Vancouver, came forward. She hadn't been taken, but she'd remembered a white van parked near her bus stop. She remembered a man in a hoodie asking if she'd seen a lost puppy. Her parents had taught her well. She ran home, locked the door, and told her mom everything. That was 2 weeks before Sophie was taken. Linney had left a trail. Quiet, intentional, targeted. But he wasn't going to hurt another kid again. He was being held without bail. The trial would come in time, but justice was moving, and it all started because a 6-year-old made a sound so soft no one else could hear it. And a German shepherd refused to ignore it. One afternoon, Mark returned to the station and found something unexpected in his mailbox. It was a letter from a family in Montana, strangers. The envelope had a return address from a town he'd never heard of, and a tiny paw print sticker on the back. Inside was a photo of a little girl hugging a tan Labrador, and a handwritten note. "My daughter was attacked last year and hasn't spoken since, but she saw the story about Rex on the news. She asked to meet a police dog. We drove 6 hours just to shake a handler's hand. She didn't say anything, but that night she whispered to our dog, 'He would have found me too. Thank you for helping us believe again.'" Mark sat with the letter for a long time. Then he pinned it next to Sophie's pink construction paper on the bulletin board. The department created a new outreach program a month later. Canine Comfort Visits. Originally intended as PR, it quickly became something much bigger. Officers with certified canines began visiting schools, libraries, and community centers, not to show off, but to teach kids that safety, strength, and comfort could come on 4 legs. Rex became the program's face. Quiet, noble, always listening. Kids would sit in circles, reading books aloud while Rex lay in the middle like a furry pillow with a badge. And sometimes, when a kid struggled, when their voice wavered, Rex would lift his head, just a little, as if to say, "I hear you." One rainy Thursday in June, Melissa invited Mark and Rex to Sophie's kindergarten graduation. "I know it's a weird ask," she said, embarrassed, "but she won't go unless he's there." Mark didn't hesitate. He wouldn't miss it. They showed up early. Sophie wore a sky-blue dress with a matching ribbon in her hair. When she saw Rex, she threw her arms around him like it was Christmas morning. She had a special seat for him, right next to hers. When the teacher called Sophie's name, she didn't walk up alone. She stood, took a deep breath, and said, "Can Rex come with me?" The teacher smiled. "Of course." So the entire auditorium watched a 6-year-old and a German Shepherd walk hand in paw across the stage. And no one, not one person, thought it was strange. They thought it was perfect. Later that night, as the sun set behind Elkwood and families returned to their routines, Mark sat with Rex outside the station. They watched the quiet town go still. Children were safe. Doors were locked. Mothers exhaled. "Not bad for a dog, huh?" Mark said, scratching behind Rex's ear. Rex didn't move. He was listening, still listening, always listening. Summer in Elkwood had always meant cookouts and bare feet on warm grass, the scent of lemonade, and sprinklers spinning like pinwheels. But that year, after the rescue, the arrest, the healing, it meant something more. It meant second chances, not just for Sophie, but for the whole town. Rex was officially retired from active canine patrol service in late July. Not because he couldn't do the work anymore, he could, but because Mark, after 15 years on the force, knew when a dog had already given more than he ever owed. "He's earned his peace," Mark told the chief, who simply nodded and said, "Let him rest, knowing he's a legend." And Rex? He didn't mind the slower pace. He still came to the station every now and then, still took his morning walks around the block, still barked once if a squirrel got too bold on the steps. But now, he spent most afternoons sprawled out on the porch of Mark's modest farmhouse just outside town, sunning his paws and snoozing under the open sky. He was no longer chasing criminals. He was chasing butterflies, and that was just fine. Mark had adjusted too. After decades of serving others, he was learning how to sit still, how to enjoy quiet that wasn't filled with tension. He gardened, built a porch swing by hand, helped coach Little League when the sheriff's kid twisted his ankle mid-season. But most afternoons, he found himself back at the kitchen table with Rex at his feet, sipping iced tea and rereading Sophie's pink letter. "You're the only one who heard me." He never stopped being grateful for that moment, for the whisper that saved her, and for the ears that caught it. Sophie was thriving. She'd traded nightmares for bike rides. Quiet lunches in the school counselor's office became crowded picnics in the sun. She still had therapy once a week, but now she brought drawings instead of fears. Drawings of dogs and hearts and houses with smiling suns overhead. And every single one included a big-eared German Shepherd in the corner. Dr. Harper asked once why he was always drawn bigger than the people. "Because he hears more than all of them," Sophie answered. Melissa cried when she heard that, not because it made her sad, but because it made her feel like everything was going to be okay. That fall, the Elkwood County Fair added something new, the Rex Hero Award, a small-town tradition that would honor local animals who had made an impact on people's lives. The town council voted unanimously. Mark tried to argue. He wouldn't like the attention. But Melissa cut in. "It's not for him," she said. "It's for the next kid who needs to know someone's listening." So they gave Rex the very first one. They made it out of cedar wood, engraved with his paw print and the date he found Sophie. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Rex? He slept through most of it. The trial of Travis Linney finally came in November. Mark wasn't required to attend. He'd already testified in pre-trial hearings. But he went anyway. Sat in the back row, wore his dress blues, didn't blink once while the prosecution laid out the timeline, the footage, the notebook. At one point, they replayed the audio from the shed. The barely audible sound Rex had reacted to. The one no one else had noticed. It wasn't a word, just a breath. But it was enough. When the jury returned, it didn't take long. Guilty. On all counts. Mark walked out of the courthouse feeling no joy, only a quiet kind of relief. And when he got back to the truck, Rex, waiting patiently in the front seat, wagged his tail once, as if to say, "We're done here." That winter, snow dusted Elkwood early. It came gently, like someone shaking powdered sugar across the town. Sophie built a snow dog in her front yard, with stick ears and 2 raisins for eyes. She made a sign that said Rex #1 and planted it beside him. The local paper snapped a photo. It made the Christmas front page. But what no one saw, except Melissa, was that Sophie stood beside the snow dog long after it began to melt, whispering something to it and then smiling. Melissa never asked what she said. She just held her daughter's hand and stood with her in the cold, letting the quiet fill them both. On Christmas Eve, Mark got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a drawing, a child's drawing, crayon on printer paper. Another little girl hugging another dog. A simple sentence written below it. "Now I know they hear me too." There was no signature, just that. Mark placed it beside Sophie's pink letter on the wall behind his kitchen table. And he cried. Not because he was sad, but because he finally understood. Rex hadn't just saved Sophie. He had reminded people, parents, children, entire towns, that someone is always listening, even when it feels like the whole world's gone silent. Especially then. One warm afternoon the following spring, Mark sat with Rex in a field of blooming daisies, the breeze tugging at his sleeves. Sophie had come to visit that day. She wore overalls and carried a book she'd written herself, a story about a dog who found voices other people missed. "I called it The Dog Who Listened," she said proudly. Mark choked back emotion. "You nailed it, kiddo." Sophie leaned down to pet Rex. "Is he happy?" she asked. Mark nodded. "I think so." Sophie thought about it. Then she whispered something into Rex's ear. Mark didn't hear it, but Rex did. He lifted his head, wagged his tail, and looked up at the sky. "Thank you so much for following this story to the end." Stories like this remind us of the quiet strength found in animals and the power of listening, even when no one else does. We'd love to hear from you. What's a moment in your life when a dog changed everything? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to read it. And don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more true, emotional stories that honor our 4-legged heroes. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never stop listening.